Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Cannon.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. So, this week, we are back, just you and I, chatting away, and we're going to talk about stress.
Yeah, this one is really, well, I was going to say it's personal to me, but actually we've talked about this, that we both suffer from stress.
As do, I think, a lot of people in today's world.
This is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it, because I think we live in an always-on, typically high-pressured world. I think there is a lot of stress around, and I think it's easy to think it's just me. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's easy to assume wherever you are in your career that it's only this stage of your career that's stressful. So I can imagine some people say, well, Chris, you're a VP of product, you have a team of people who support you. Surely that can't be stressful. It can be stressful, but I think it's something that affects everyone. And rather than this just being an episode where we say, well, stress is bad, that's terrible. Actually, what I wanted to do was to talk about it because people don't often talk about it. It's actually another one of those. I don't know that it's shameful to talk about stress, but nobody feels comfortable when you talk about stress, and it has real impacts. And I've had some teams over the years where it's significantly impacted individuals as well as myself. But also, one of the things I'm really interested to talk about is how you actually manage and deal some of this stress and the impact. And the reason why I say it is because I've written some notes and I did a bit of sort of the usual things going onto the internet to see what people say. And funny old thing, there's lots of very good, well-meaning advice, which actually I don't know that it moves the needle. Like, you should go for a walk every day. Well, I do often go for a walk. I have a dog, and then I feel stressed while I'm walking the dog, thinking about all the things that make me stressed. So I wanted to dive into sort of not only the effects of stress, and we can talk about the real nuanced version, but also about what we can do to sort of address and reduce that stress.
Cool. I would like to look at stress from the perspective of leaders and managers, not in terms of the stress that leaders feel, because of course they do as well, but in terms of managing teams to reduce the impact of stress. And like you said, of course, stress is bad. I don't think it always is. And I think I'd like to explore where inducing stress in teams can be a useful tool. And some of the, I guess, popular culture wisdom around toxic leadership and stress. And I'd like to counter that narrative a little bit, because I think we often talk about these things as black and white, and actually I think there's, as with all these things, there's nuance and there's balance. And I think you can create a very calm working environment where there is little stress, but there's probably also going to be a reduction in productivity. And so how do you find that balance? Where is the appropriate balance, etc., etc.? So I think there's a lot more to unpack in terms of the management of stress.
Well, let's start with a fact. And I'm a great fan of the Radio 4 More or Less radio program and podcast. So I'm waiting for someone to tell me that this is not true. This is a zombie fact. But according to the American Institute of Stress, there is an institute. Do you know there's an institute for stress?
I didn't.
Their research indicates that 83% of Americans suffer from employment stress, with 25% citing employment stress as the number one source of elevated stress in their lives. Okay, the fact that there's an institute for stress, I'm pretty sure that they were bound to come out with a large number. But I do think, irrespective of the number, this really does affect a huge number of people, both in work, at home. It has a disproportionate effect on what goes on in our world, and by definition, as we'll talk about later, the decisions we make, the things we choose to do, the performance, and ultimately how we feel about life.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think being the father of two children under the age of 10, I would argue there are other stress factors in life.
100%.
Being a parent is incredibly stressful, and I think a lot of people feel that. On one hand, when you say 83% of Americans, suffer from employment stress, and that can sound horrific, and we'll go, oh my God, how could we have got ourselves into this position? But another way of looking at it is work is one of the biggest things you do.
Of course, of course.
It involves, by its nature, work. That's what it is, and therefore it's not surprising that it's a stress-inducing activity.
It's not surprising, but I think our lack of skills to address and manage it is more surprising by the definition of that.
Yeah. I'm surprised in that, and maybe it's just the source for that quote, but I'm surprised it doesn't have the word chronic as that being the defining bad thing.
But I think that's another thing, which is, as you said, which is about the different causes of stress, which is stress is I've got a presentation I have to give today, and so I'm slightly stressed about it, but after the presentation I'm now fine and I wait until the next presentation. Whereas chronic stress is getting up in the morning and feeling unwell, and I think I've shared this on a previous podcast. When I was learning to be a navigator, when I was on my observer course in the Royal Navy, I woke up, would throw up, and then I would get on with my day. I realize now that is chronic stress, and I have other indicators of chronic stress, which many of my friends, family, and even co-workers know what those are. But you're right, there's this line. The problem is, though, and we'll come on to this hopefully maybe more later, is I don't think people are very good at tracking that line.
Yeah.
And I've been in workplaces where all of a sudden we're working hard. Bob's not in today because Bob's ill. And you would hope that an organization would say, I see the stress levels of my team increasing. We have to monitor this. We have to protect against this. And more often than not, what I see is we sort of have this generic sense of there is a stressful environment. And that's kind of where it ends until someone says, I can't do this anymore for whatever reason. Yeah. Isn't it interesting where there are other things where we have much clearer sense of how well or how our teams are performing? Stress is one of those, I think, that is actually seen a lot less in the civilian world. We talked about this a couple of episodes ago about how you, when you came back from Afghanistan, didn't decompress, but the second time you came back, they sent you to Cyprus. So the military seems to have a little bit more of a sense of stress. And again, we talked in an earlier episode where there's a board where you track how many nights people have worked and things like that.
Yeah, we did.
I just don't think we have a sense of that in the civilian world.
No, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's been a friend of mine for the past 20 years. And we went through university together, and then he joined the army, I joined the Royal Marines, and we went through those early years of junior leadership as a young officer, him in the army, Afghanistan, Iraq. For me, it was Afghanistan, Iraq, counter-piracy, the Somalia stuff, and all the other things that come with being a junior leader in the military. Lots of periods of stressful stuff. But we were reminiscing and looking through old photographs. And mostly those are photographs from nights out, from hanging around together, mornings after where we looked particularly unwell, all sorts of things. And we were just sort of reminiscing. But it was really apparent how, and part of this is an age thing, of course, but we worked hard and we played hard. There are certain careers, there are certain institutions where they're renowned for working hard and playing hard. And I wonder how much of that is a balance. And it's this idea of, because I think when I talk about stress, and I talk about the fact that, for a good proportion of my career, I was either on operations, preparing to go on operations, at high readiness to react to my phone going off to go on operations, or on leave, having just come back from operations. And so I could very easily paint a picture of saying, well, for 10 years, I was chronically stressed. I was constantly thinking about the what ifs. I was constantly on edge. And then I can look through these photos and talk about 10 years of, actually, we did a lot of partying, we did a lot of socializing, we did a lot of decompressing. And I think those two things are very connected.
So we should talk about the work hard, play hard. So this is a phrase that's used a lot in the military. I think it's used in other organizations, but predominantly the military. And I think it's fair to say work hard, play hard implies in the evenings drinking,
Yeah, I think
often
absolutely,
drinking,
absolutely.
and
Certainly in
certainly
Western culture,
going out as a team,
tied to
going
drinking.
out and going. And this is not about sort of what they do, but going to excess to some degree.
Yeah, yeah.
But what's really interesting for me is as a person, and maybe this is I get a little bit older, the idea of going out in a large group, drinking to excess is the thing that is right at the opposite of what I would ever want to do.
Oh, I'm absolutely.
Hang on, don't worry. This isn't actually about to sort of say that this is a bad habit of the military, but and actually when I was in the Navy, I didn't like that. That wasn't me. There's elements of introvert nature, which is I need to go away and be quiet on my own somewhere. But what's interesting to me is I think a different lens, exactly as you've said, is that work hard, play hard. A different way of saying it is work hard and actively manage that stress by doing other activities to, as it were, manage that. Now, when you then talk about the civilian world, there just isn't that sense of work hard, play hard. There's the sense of work hard, go home in the evenings. And don't get me wrong, there are groups of people who do the play hard bit, but I've never heard it sort of described in that sense, where I think there's an implicit sense in the military where there is an element of that. But it's funny, it had never occurred to me before. It had just been like, I don't want to do that. That's not my thing. But actually, it's a very important team building exercise and potentially de-stressor.
Yeah, as we say this, I'm trying to think. Like, certainly, these are industries I've never worked in, but the media, popular culture would certainly suggest that things like commodities trading, banking, finance industry, they have a reputation for work hard, play hard. They eat their young, long hours.
But I love that. It's the premise for the playing hard is about a sense of toughness.
Yeah.
When actually, perhaps that's not right. Perhaps it is
Absolutely.
a sense. I mean, there is obviously a sense of that. Obviously, it's typically younger people where they might do that anyway. But
I do think there's an interesting thing here, which is perhaps these are, partly it's about being tough. It's about these are industry, the military, one of them, where, being tough, being able to take risks, these are parts of the culture that people want to engender and encourage. But I want to pick up on something you said about this is the way people then de-stress and work as groups and teams. And as a society and progressively recognize things like inherent drinking cultures are not perhaps the healthiest thing to have in an industry or in a line of work. As we recognize these taking things to extremes leads to toxic behaviors, it leads to really bad things. Perhaps the way of viewing this is that if you don't manage stress as a factor of the business that you're in, then culture will manage it for you, and that will generate potentially negative behavior.
I think that's really, really well said. The fact that we have just argued that a significant part of the playing hard world is to relieve stress, and that not once has anyone ever said, "Hey guys, we're going to play hard tonight to relieve stress."
Yeah,
implies you're absolutely right. Well, look, let's talk about stress triggers. I don't think actually before we talk about stress triggers, I was thinking about this afternoon before we sort of came to record this, and it is really important to say we are not experts in identifying, managing stress. In fact, particularly, definitely don't ask me. I've done a terrible job over the years. I think you'd probably say the same. So, for those people listening to this, if this is important to you, if you are impacted by stress, while I hope this is an interesting conversation, please go talk to people about it. And we'll talk about this later in terms of what I've done to manage stress over the years. And one of those is talk to people.
Yeah.
So please, this is not the how Chris and Gareth think you should solve your stress problems. Please go see the right people at the right time. Good.
Yeah, absolutely. reiterate that and say that stress is clearly very implicitly linked to mental health issues
Yes.
and all the rest of it. This is not a discussion, from any kind of medical perspective about mental health. This is about managing stress and being aware of stress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also I think part of this is about as managers and leaders, can we identify the environment that we can create to minimize it?
Yeah.
Can we identify when people are under stress? Do we understand the impact it has? And we'll do more of that. So again, I wrote this down just off the top of my head, which is, what is it that triggers stress? And over the years, I've had many individuals on my team who have sat down in front of me and said, Chris, I'm really, really stressed. In fact, they're implying to me I'm under chronic stress at the moment, whether it's lack of sleep, whether it's performance, whatever it might be. First thing that causes this often is too much work.
Yep.
And what's interesting about this one is I've found this after 32 years of being a product manager and longer in various roles, sort of in the military as well. It's really difficult to measure and judge how much work is too much work. If you said to me today, what is the work capacity of my team? I have no useful way of accurately and in detail. Now, don't get me wrong, we've got spreadsheets, we've got capacity plans for teams, we do velocity, there's all sorts of things. But when you look at that person in front of you and you think, I have a new task for you, or I need to apply pressure to you to do a thing for me under conditions of stress, it is really hard to know whether or not they have capacity, or whether you are pushing them past the 110% mark. And by the way, one of the things I pick up on is people will often tell me when they were working last night.
Yeah.
And there's people try to give you these little cues, even if they don't know, but like, I was working till 10 o'clock all week. That's a warning sign.
But I think that is the default where most of us go when you talk about the metric for work. How much are you working? Time is that default metric. And of course, time is finite and it doesn't necessarily indicate output.
Well, and also you get this thing about time where people say the next problem with this is, and I'm getting better, is let me tell you what you don't need to do to win you some time back. Well, we'll talk about that later. That can be a useful thing. But I've often found most of the people who work for me are smart, intelligent people. They have already made a judgment about the things they don't have to do. So be really, really, maybe this is a good way to start, which is when someone comes to you under chronic stress or severe stress, they're not asking you to solve their problems. No. It's not like, all I need is the right answer, Chris. If only you can give me the right. No, that's not what they're doing. So anyway,
I can only talk from personal experience here, but when I'm struggling with the volume of output that I need to produce, I'm picking my words quite carefully here, I find my ability to achieve things really reduces over time.
Well,
and so if you, as a manager or as a leader, try and view this from a time perspective, without recognizing that something that takes an unstressed person 15 minutes, 20 minutes to do, and then send an email quickly to a colleague, to a stressed person might be something they fret over, might be something they push off, might be something they stare at a blinking cursor on a screen for 10 minutes before they can bring themselves to even type something. If you use time as your metric, then you're not actually solving the problem, you're solving the symptom of the problem.
Stress is a compounding problem.
Absolutely.
That is really, really important. Now, everyone listening to this will say, wow, Chris, thank you. You've told us something really interesting, that there's too much work. That's the obvious one.
Yeah.
And I often feel that is more of a symptom than it is the problem.
Yeah.
But it can be the problem, but it's more a symptom. Next thing that I found triggers stress is lack of skills or experience.
Yeah.
I'm asking you to do something that it turns out you don't have the skills or experience to do. Now, it might be reasonably straightforward, but you've never done it before. The classic example for people is getting them to present. If people haven't done a lot of presentations before, a 10-minute presentation will have people spinning for weeks.
Yeah.
Whereas someone idiot like me, fine, just tell me what you want me to talk about for 10 minutes and you can tell me 2 seconds before I step up. So it's that that lack of skills or experience can also be a significant factor, which is why it's important to be really thoughtful when you give someone something to do. Are you setting them up for success? Do they have the skills or the support to do that?
I think this is where we've hit upon the first stress isn't always bad, because this is where lack of skills and experience in the task that needs to be achieved smashes straight up against mentoring, coaching, developing.
I think the key there was with the right support.
Absolutely.
If you said, good luck, tell me how it goes, not useful. If you say, here's a thing you've never done before, here's some support, here's some coaching, here's some help. Hey, I'll help you through it.
Yeah.
You're right. But, and I don't want to use the word positive or negative stress, but I think my experience, unfortunately, is more on the side of chronic stress, as opposed to me worrying about the stress of developing people. But I think it's a really fair point.
But I think this is where we've talked before about the fact that in the military, there's a distinction between actual operations and warfighting and exercises and training. And in the commercial world, there's far less of the latter.
You have to be really... Time is usually at a premium. There are usually a stack of tasks that need to be done.
Yeah.
And if you get through those tasks, then there's more things you want to do to, as it were, to further move forward and further develop things. The idea that you take time out of your day to develop people, to spend precious time on a skill they don't necessarily need today, it is much harder. So I think your comparison between the two is absolutely right. And it's funny, you go to any organization, you say, do you think that developing people is important and training them is important? The answer is always yes. The moment there is pressure in the business, that's the first thing that will often go.
Yeah.
And so we're very bad as organizations. So of course I want to develop you, but not this week, because we're busy this week. Let's make it next week, perhaps, and it continues on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next one, this is a product managery thing, but product management from the perspective of how I see it. But I think this is really true for anyone, whatever you do. Unclear prioritization. What do I mean by that? Every person I know has either written down, in my case, because I'm a nerd, I write it all down, or in your head, a list of things that you must do, you should do, you want to do. There's a big, long list of things.
Yeah.
And they all blend together. Often, you don't prioritize them. So it's difficult to know two things. Which things should I focus on? And actually, there is a paralysis that I've got 17 things on the list.
Yeah.
I've actually seen this, lots of people, coincidentally, a couple of years ago with some UX folks, so some designers. And so they are often people who are invited by multiple parts of any business to participate in some design activities. And unless you sit down with them and help them through, everyone who's come to you has told you that their thing is really important. Who's here to tell you from a business perspective which of those are the most important? So unclear prioritization is just this stressor that says I should be doing all of these things.
Yeah.
And I don't know which one. If I don't do this, they're going to shout at me, or maybe they won't. I don't know. So unclear prioritization.
And that links to two of my hobby horses on this podcast, strategy and command. Strategy is knowing how you're going to achieve your goals and what the journey you're going on is as an organization, but also as an individual, what your part in that is. And command, which is the very, very clear articulation of accountability, responsibility, and authority, which allows you to do that. But prioritization comes in two flavors. There's prioritization by time. This task needs to be completed by Friday, otherwise it's pointless because the deadline is Friday for the client, or whatever. Or this is priority because if it doesn't get done, it's safety and it's critical, or this is low priority. And so there's a skill in being able to balance things that are critical but long term, things that are critical and need to be done now, things that are not so important but need to be done now, and things that are low importance and can be pushed. And those last things are first of all, the things that you go, well, don't worry about those.
Well, now
They're the things that start to compound over time.
but let me tell you why it's even more insidious than that. Most people, no matter where you are in your career, have 5 different people telling you to do things. And each person says, let me be clear, this is the order. If you have any questions, you can come to me. I will go through exactly what you've just said. This is urgent. This is important.
Yeah.
This is, well, they'll do that.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fine. And I say, look, I'm a great leader, Gareth. I will do that for any member of my team. The problem my team has is they also have 5 other people doing the same thing to them, and they're struggling to now resolve all of these things. Now, you are right. If they understand the strategy, if you coach and you mentor people to make those decisions, but what I'm saying is the reality is that happens less frequent than you might hope. And what you've got is people saying, I've got a to-do list with 20 things on it.
Yeah.
I've got 10 people demanding these things. I am struggling to resolve all of these things, and it ends up in unresolved prioritizing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's human nature. Everybody thinks that, and in reality, the center of everybody's universe is them. So they overinflate the importance of their task and the impact it's going to have. The advantage the military has over commercial organizations.
Fewer people giving those orders.
Well, it's about a very clear command. And it is a hobby horse, so I will bang on about it. But command is not, I command you to do something. There is giving commands. Command is about knowing the authority, accountability, and responsibility. And in the military, we have very clear rank structures. So if somebody comes to you and says, I'm telling you this is the most important thing, you can say, that's nice, but my direct commander is somebody over here, and they don't see it that way. So,
well, to resolve this in the civilian world, and I'm sure we're going to bounce around a lot in this conversation. If you have that problem, if you have 5 people coming to you, all, as it were, ignoring that there's another 4 people coming to you, go to your boss, and say to them, help me resolve this. The boss, if they're any good, will say, I understand the challenge. I will work with you. There are ways we can relieve this. Either we all come together and talk about those priorities. But again, the classic case is, I don't want to let anyone down. And so therefore, I'm going to try my hardest to resolve this myself, even if that means a poor outcome for me, or worse, a poor outcome for the business.
Yeah, you can do a lot of things poorly, or you can do a few things well.
Yeah.
And this is where that conversation in the military, I'd say, is really easy, because if somebody comes to you and says, do this, it's the highest priority, and you say, well, that's not what I've been told to do by my commander, they can either say, oh, okay, and walk away, or they can say, well,
I think there's
get it.
I think there's an equivalent in the civilian world, which is this is what my boss is telling me I need to focus on. Look, I hear what you're saying. If you think that's not right, go talk to them. I think that works. Next one I've got here is high expectations, peer and professional pressure. Now we're dancing again around this, for want of a better word, good stress to sort of help you peak in your performance. I remember when I was at Dartmouth, one of the cadets, actually, I think it was in the term after me, so there was a more junior cadet, had a post-it note on her desk that said, her name was Blogs or whatever it was, Blogs can always do better. And I remember us all sitting there going, this doesn't end well for her.
No,
you are literally telling yourself you're not good enough.
Yeah.
And all of the rest of us were metaphorically leaning against the door frame, smoking a roll-up cigarette, going, yeah, that's not the right way to think about these things. Yeah. There's professional pride and development, but then there is this unrealistic expectation. We've all seen it. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, so I'm going to be a doctor even if I hate doing it. It makes me miserable. So that's another one. And by the way, as we go through these, each one of these you go, oh yeah, I see that. The problem is these are all invisible. these bloody things are invisible. You can't see them. And you've got people out there who are actually bumping into some or all of these to different degrees.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you can ratchet the stress up, and someone says, "Oh, well, I haven't given blogs too much work. Why are they stressed?" No, there's all these other things going on.
Yeah, and this is where I think having these conversations about these things is really important. And yeah, the listeners will know I've just come off a 3-week leadership course, which was brilliant. But one of the most insightful things for me was we had a dinner during the course. Yeah, a formal dinner, yeah, after dinner speakers, all that sort of thing. And the two most inspiring people on the whole course. It's the whole course about leadership, about management, about command in a military sense, I suppose. And the two most inspiring people were the director of the academic institute that ran the course and a former manager who came back, having gone off to do other things, to give an after dinner speech in the formal dinner. And what was really interesting was they were inspiring not because they came and said, "This is how you do it," or "Here from my 30-year career, what I've learned." They came in and said, "Here's how I think about these problems. These are my, you know, take it or leave it, top tips." And they were very humble about the fact that because they were senior, didn't make them any more wise, or it probably does, of course, but from their perspective, it's like these are just the things I've written down and thought about and evolved. And one of them, we talked in a previous episode about the fact that we were asked to derive our leadership philosophies. And somebody asked the question, said, "Well, what's your leadership philosophy?" And he said, "Oh, I don't really know what a leadership philosophy is. You put me on the spot, but let me just, you know, throw out in a few bullet points my view on how I approach these things." And I think this is where it's really important that people in positions of authority, managers, who are leaders by default, talk about, you know, rather than people in that organization or that team, you've got to constantly do better, you've got to constantly improve. Actually, say, what's really important to me is every time we do something, we learn from it. And that subtly changes and you would hope
Well,
that,
you've the language. I mean, so much of what we do comes down to language. There's a difference between do better,
yeah,
which implies you weren't trying, you didn't succeed, and learn, which nobody would feel bad about. I want to learn. I know I learned.
yeah.
So there's language.
But you would hope the more that these conversations
Yeah.
happen, blogs will go back to their dorm room or whatever, look at that thing on the wall and go, that language doesn't chime anymore, and they rewrite it.
It's so funny though that we're going through this, and I scribbled down some thoughts in preparation for a podcast. I don't know that I've ever sat down with my team and said, "Let's talk about stress, guys." And I'll talk about this later. And actually, we stop for a break in a second, which is one of the things that I think is a really good way of tackling stress is talking about stuff.
Yeah.
And not just talking to the person who is stressed or the team that is stressed, but talking to them before they're stressed and helping them think about it and recognize what those things are. So, I need to do this with my team and sit down and say, these are the things which either you will have suffered from,
Yeah.
or your team members. We need to be thoughtful about this, and we need to talk about these. Last thing I want to talk about individual. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about stress triggers for the team. The last one, and I know this will go on for a couple of minutes, is stressors, expectations within a team. You need to do well because we can't screw up.
Yeah.
Now, that one's another one of those ones, which is there is positive peer pressure and a sense of momentum in a team and standards and goals and come on, we can go do this. And then there's a line that says, even if you can't do this or you don't think you can do this, if you fail, you are betraying us. You are letting us down.
Letting other people down.
And it's such there are many people who would be heartbroken if they thought their come on, we could do this was causing more stress. But there's that as well. So there are so many subtle reasons why people are stressed. And as we said, these are compounding. When one of them happens, it means you're more susceptible to the other. And when you, this is something we'll talk about later in terms of maybe de-stressing, but there's a point at which, and I can see it in people's eyes, where people are so stressed. I could literally go and say, I have just saved a baby from a burning building. And they will go, well, that's bloody typical, isn't it? That's just bloody typical. You go, what? I've just said a good thing. And the point is, this stress has got them to the point. It makes it difficult to process. It makes it difficult to make good decisions. Anyway, we'll come more.
But you're in a situation there where there's almost a friction between, for leaders, whether they're the formal leader, the manager, or just people who are by their nature leading, the friction between motivating the team, highlighting the success,
and pushing them too far,
telling everybody how successful they are. That and the military has, of course, a very, very strong connection to its history, to its traditions, to its battle honours, and all of this is part of developing what we call the esprit de corps, the idea of being proud of the badge that you wear, the unit you're from, because of the great things that your forebears did before you, and therefore the great things that you're capable of.
Oh, to feel that ratcheting up
suddenly, huge amount of pressure. And as a leader, there's, how do you find that balance between maintaining that team's belief in itself, that they are capable, that they are good, that they are trained and ready, versus individuals who might either be slightly weaker in some areas or just have the perception that they are slightly weaker, and they might not be. And then that becomes a crack that grows.
Well, and I want to talk about this concept of stress. I said I was going to stop. We will have a break in a second. This concept of stress, and not just at an individual level and then a team level, is like running an engine.
Yeah.
I've got an engine. We can do 80 miles an hour. Let's push it to 90 miles an hour. Oh, look, it's in the red. It's absolutely fine. Keep going. Just a little bit more. We can do a little more. And the next thing you know, the engine has just exploded and there's bits of car all over the road and everyone's dead. Oh, look, when did we go from I am running the engine at its optimum, getting the best output, all very quickly it goes to the thing exploded.
Yeah.
This is true on a team, which is what you've talked about, is how do you extract the most performance? How do you get the best out of a team? How do you build a team? How do you push them further they can go? But there's a point at which they throw their things down the floor and say, you're on your own. I'm not doing this anymore with you. That's really hard. And by the way, anyone thinking I know how to measure the difference between those two, don't look at me. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And by the way, I often get it wrong. I often have people who are pushed too far. I can see teams under enormous stress. That's really hard. That actually, guess what? You're going to laugh. That stresses me. It keeps me awake at night when I see teams under stress and understanding tomorrow, do I need to push them more, or do I need to step back a little bit when everyone else is saying push them, push them.
I love the analogy of the engine, because that, taking it a little bit further, I'm thinking straight away about racing teams, and then I'm thinking about a drag race versus a 24-hour endurance race, a rally versus a Formula One smooth tarmac track. They require different skills, they require different balances, but all of them require some sort of decision making under conditions of uncertainty about when do you do the pit stop, when do you do the world change, when do you let your driver sleep?
How fast do you push before they come off the road?
Yeah.
So no, it's good. Look, we're over where we're on to stop, but let's take a quick break here. I'd love to do a similar thing around stress triggers for teams, because I think these are two separate areas to look at, but they contribute. But then let's do a bit of time talking about how we de-stress maybe some of these. So see you straight after the break. Welcome back. Just before the break, we actually had a really good conversation about some of the triggers of stress. And I hope, having done quite a bit of reading, okay, admittedly lightweight reading, I think we've done a pretty good job of actually talking about some of the nuances and complexities in the real world of what causes stress. Let's just do teams quickly, and I'll actually read through these all in one go. Oh, this first one. Unrealistic or seemingly unrealistic goals. This one really makes me annoyed. If I set an unrealistic goal, the team will step up and it'll all be great. Or you could destroy the team by setting an unrealistic goal. The question, what's the difference between a stretched goal and an unrealistic goal? How do you know when you're going to the red line on the engine or whether you're about to thrash the engine and the piston's about to come out of the engine?
Yeah, I was going to ask that question really is what do you mean by an unrealistic goal? Because to me, straight away, if you set an unrealistic goal, that strikes me as that's just going to be a demotivator.
You would be staggered how many people set unrealistic goals every day.
Deliberately.
I've seen two things. I've seen A, deliberate tactics of setting an unrealistic goal because if I stretch them, then they'll stretch towards this, which is ludicrous, which is a bad thing. And generally, you find these are leaders who don't last very long or they move on very quickly. But the second one, which is probably more insidious, that honestly, that probably happens rarely. There's very few people who say, I'm going to send my people up that hill where there's a machine gun, but I'm going to tell them they'll all be fine.
Before we get accused of being massive hypocrites, can we just expand on why setting an unrealistic goal in this context with the team is different from a big, hairy, audacious goal?
Yes, and what I mean by an unrealistic goal is setting a goal where there are clear indications we cannot achieve this. And the often the motivation for setting that goal is they will get 3/4 of the way, and that's really where I want them to get to. But if I tell them all the way, that they'll stretch them. So the thing about the BHAG is you might not know how to get there, but we will work on that together and we will go in that direction.
So I think the difficulty here is that we're using the word goal for two different things. One is talking about a strategic objective.
Yes.
And one is talking about a team goal, something they need to achieve.
Yes.
In a defined
yeah.
period of time. Yeah.
And by the I was going to give an example, don't need to. But the second one is more insidious. The second one is one which I have seen across 30 years. I see this more often than not. Someone doesn't inherently understand what is possible. And so they set a goal going, this is possible. I think this is possible. And they haven't actually spoken to anyone and they haven't talked through it. And actually, I'll give you, here you go. This is for people who listen out for it. Sometimes there is a proxy for the phrase, I am setting you a goal that I actually don't know whether you can achieve or not. And the proxy is, we have to do it. I've heard people use the phrase, we have to do it. And I go, I understand this is something that we must do, but please do not turn that into a goal for people when you don't know how to do it. We have no evidence we can do it. We haven't. Hope is not a plan. So anyway,
yeah.
Rather than spending too much time, unrealistic or seemingly unrealistic goals, your teams are smart. When you set a goal, they know immediately, am I going to easily make this goal? Is this hard, but I have a chance? Or have you just set me up for failure?
Yeah.
Sometimes the team won't think they can get there, but you do know they can get there. Again, that's different. But notice how we're dancing on the head of a pin here, which is you have to be really good to understand the difference between those two things.
I suspect there are, and our listeners will probably be thinking about these things. There are circumstances where exploration, experimentation means that you don't know if it's a realistic goal.
But you just used the word.
But experimentation. You've just got to be very, very clear that that's the purpose.
And actually, you said the word experimentation.
Yeah.
Experimentation, to some degree, is a success when you experiment.
Yeah.
If the experiment is a failure, it's still a success.
You've learned. Yeah.
So that's good. The next one is one which I'll be quiet for 5 minutes because this is your bailiwick right here. Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Now, that's not because anyone's done anything wrong. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Uncertainty is a killer. It is naturally stressful. People want to know, what am I doing? When am I doing it? How am I going to do it? Do I have evidence I can be successful? There are 1,001 pieces of uncertainty you can insert. Gareth,
Yeah,
away
so
you go.
we've talked a lot over previous episodes
He's
about,
shaking his head or nodding his head in a way that we've talked a lot about this.
yeah, uncertainty is a natural state of, you know, not knowing what is going to happen because there are things outside of your control, there are things external to the influence that you can have, and that's perfectly fine. Recognizing when you're in a position of uncertainty rather than just not having explored all the information at your disposal is really important. And this comes back to that Cynefin framework, knowing whether it's a complex problem or a complicated problem. Uncertainty, by its nature, is stressful because we as a species have evolved to seek certainty. The more uncertain we are, the more exposed we are to risk we can't control, the more likely we are to get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger or
Sorry, can I just check? Is there a possibility I could get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger this week? Yeah,
always.
I'll write that. You've just now made me more stressed.
Yeah, the uncertainty of can I get home without running out of water?
Yeah.
These are things that for 80,000 years of evolutionary development
Range
worried about.
uncertainty on electric cars.
Straight away, that is a synonymous link to, how far can I go with access to clean fresh water, which for 80,000 years, probably longer, that is something that we had to worry about. And in the West now, we obviously don't have to worry about. But yeah, uncertainty is something we naturally seek to avoid as individuals and as teams. And that stifles creativity, it stifles innovation, and it also means that there is a natural inhibitor for us to face the challenge. But in a competitive environment, to get ahead, we need to take risk. And so there's a real link here between careful management of risk. We've mentioned this before. Risk is not a negative thing. Quite often we think of risk as negative because we actually start to think about the consequences of risk. And we think about, if we say take risk to life, for example, we think about the injury or the death that can be created by the action. But risk itself is neutral. Risk is a probability, it's a balance of likely outcomes. It needs to be managed as a neutral thing, and we need to balance opportunity versus negative consequence, and we need to face uncertainty. But with it, we also recognize or need to recognize that the people that we are asking to face that uncertainty are going to feel greater levels of stress. So in my world, previously in the military, if you ask somebody to go out into the darkness in pitch black and do a patrol where there is enemy out there somewhere, guess what? Their stress levels are going to go through the roof because suddenly they are outside of that comfort of the security base and that protection and that knowledge that you've got intimate fires and you've got people who know what they're doing, and now you're exposed and there's people that could be all around you. In the commercial world, if you ask people to do something that may not work, it may not pay off, and there is a risk that they're going to have to come back on Monday morning and explain that it didn't work and it cost the company lots of money, then they're going to feel very stressed about it.
We'll come on to that one in a second. As you were talking, though, I am reminded of our, as human beings, inherent optimism and the risk that brings. We've talked about a bunch of things that stress individuals and teams and haven't even finished yet. And I can hear in our own voices, there's almost a confidence that there's a way to solve all of these things. And I fear that confidence, not just that extends in the day to day, which is sure, all of these things are stressors, but they're not as bad as you think they are. When, of course, the problem is it's not what we think they are, because often we're in a position to say, well, I know all the facts. I actually understand the risks.
Yeah.
I can manage the uncertainty. Of course, when you get to the people on the ground, it's a very different world.
You're back to my old friend heuristics, and there's a clash here of the optimism bias of things will be all right, things will work out, the things that go wrong, it's bad luck, the things that go well, that's my genius, versus the risk avoidance and the risk aversion bias. So what tends to happen then is people making the decisions are overly optimistic. People then having to manage the consequence of those decisions and do the
That's the
doing
stressful bit.
are now risk averse. And so you end up with this compounding. It'll be fine, go and do it,
We've
work
said
it.
this so many times, which is that's another insidious element about this is compounding effect, which is as a manager, as a leader, I might say, I'm asking a team member to do something they've not done before, but it's okay because I'm going to support them, blah, blah, blah. As we have discussed, though, with these compounding effects, they may be at stress factor 4 already. And so when I ask them something very reasonable, actually I'm tipping them over the edge. And that's so hard to see. Look, we're coming to the end of the hour and well, I didn't think actually this one would be as much of a discussion. I think we should go for a part 2 because I really want to talk about what we can do to de-stress or
Okay.
manage the
Yeah.
stress. But let's finish maybe on the last couple of things, which is other things that stress a team. And I hope this is useful for people as we've gone through this, because when you read it out, it's self-evident. But I don't think I've ever seen it laid out in this way, in a way that is really crystal clear. Like these are things that you see every day, and they are contributing and building and building and building an invisible level of stress.
Yeah.
And the problem is, I remember back to our conversation with Mary Brazier when she was talking about managing stress and trauma in battle. We talked about this idea that it's actually really hard to look at a person and say, I see you are under enormous stress, or you are reaching the limits of your resilience.
Well, I think there are physiological effects.
There are.
But by the time you see those, it's true.
You're in trouble. You're in trouble.
You are well into chronic stress
exactly.
periods.
Anyway, last couple of things it's worth talking about for a team. This one is I have learned over the years this is really hard to overcome. A history of failure. If you have a group of people in a team who have failed in the past, it brings an inherent stress around their performance. There is already an expectation that is higher. There is already, to some degree, blame. I've seen this. I've worked with some very high performing teams where their resilience to stress is significantly higher, and some teams where the performance has been lower. Arguably, they should be just as resilient because they're skilled, they're clever people, but simply, for want of better word, their narrative is around failure, and therefore their heads drop. Now, I bet you see this in the military with units that have done well or done poorly and how they behave under stress.
So I've talked before about the fact that there are principles of war, which in itself sounds a bit odd, but there are. And one of the overarching principles of war is maintenance of morale. We've talked before about the triumvirate of physical component, moral component, conceptual component. So one is about understanding how you fight and how it all comes together, and your doctrine and your principles and your drills and all of that really good stuff that makes a professional military force work. A lot of it is about the technology, the weapons, the capabilities that you physically have, the amount of people, all of those kind of good things. And the most important one, and of course, everybody thinks that tactics and capability are the most important things, but the most important one is the will to fight, that moral component. And if you can break somebody's morale, if you can break their will to fight, then it doesn't matter how well supported, how well trained, and how much capability they've got.
I have seen that in the civilian world. I've seen teams which were deemed to be failing teams, and that I saw as the direct equivalent of the lack of will to fight.
Yeah.
And everyone looks and says, well, you're idiots. And it is a self-fulfilling activity. So that is a huge stressor. We have not succeeded in the past. We feel we care, and therefore that's stressful. Next one is one that people isn't, I think they're all obvious, blame culture.
Yeah.
If there is a blame culture, I am now stressed because rather than having the confidence to look forward, I am looking over my shoulder. I am nervous. Either I don't want to get in trouble, or I think twice about something because I want to be doubly sure when actually we want you to think once. So blame culture is another one of those. And blame culture is never as straightforward as someone says you're a bad person. That rarely, rarely happens. These are all grades. It's the, well, you guys never do this. Oh, wait a minute, that's you're attacking my will to fight again. You have built a narrative around a group of people. You're saying they never succeed. You are actually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. It sort of goes back to that will to fight.
And it in itself creates bad behaviors, because once you have a blame culture, people feel stressed about the negative outcomes. They will work harder to avoid those spotlight being upon them than they will to be successful. And so suddenly people will actively work to avoid detection, to avoid their activity being scrutinized. And that creates this compounding effect of people hide stuff.
Well, also, I think people are smart. And I've experienced this in my life, which is someone comes to me and says, you guys are idiots, you did a bad thing. And I think, hang on a minute. I'd like to think I'm balanced. I'm accountable. I take responsibility. No, this wasn't our fault. Wait a minute. Why are you pointing at us? And so there's not only that sort of that sense of it has a negative impact, the blame itself. More often than not, I tend to get angry, which is like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
You are confident in blaming us, and in blaming us, you are demonstrating you don't actually understand what's going on. Anyway, the point about this is, though, each one of these things is stress and stress and stress and stress, and you can only stretch the elastic band too long.
Well, I think there is a really important aspect of that as well, which is not just being blamed when things haven't gone wrong or a team hasn't, but also the genuine mistakes.
Yeah.
And people will cover those up and hide them. And I've said this before, but one of my favorite quotes about management and about creating the culture of management that is successful is General Stan McChrystal, where he said, never punish mistakes, always punish negligence. And if you have a blame culture, you punish mistakes, people will hide them from you. And therefore, when it becomes apparent, it's when it's too late.
There's all of these things we talk about have fine lines, which is mistake versus negligence. I have seen people in the past say, you screwed up. And they have said those words because they are honest, and because they are, and they're not, as it were, blaming people, but they're saying it's a screw up. Actually, it wasn't negligence. It was a mistake. Perhaps even that person wasn't even able to influence that mistake. The person who says you screwed up is trying to say, I want you to have a sense of accountability.
Yeah.
The stressing thing is, I know it was a screw up. You don't need to poke me in the face.
Yeah.
You don't need to poke me in the eye and remind. I am working really hard to correct these problems.
But I think
isn't that an interesting balance?
It is.
You want to push people, you want to make them accountable, and yet there's that line that says you've just failed because actually now someone feels worse and is less inclined to be accountable.
Yeah.
They've got lower will to fight. I get up every morning and I am working my balls off to try and make this work. Something didn't work.
Yeah.
And rather than someone saying, well, that was a mistake, did you learn? They say, well, you screwed up there.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And what you end up with is, like I say, in those cultures, people will hide their mistakes. Whereas if you don't do that, and if you have a genuinely open learning culture where people say, this didn't go well, this decision was made, and these were the consequences, and it didn't go well, but the decision was made for the right reasons because of X, Y, and Z. So what can we learn?
I was going to say, and for people who say, I do that, do you do that? But is that what the other person hears?
Yeah.
Because I've heard that.
Yeah.
I've heard that before, which is like they literally say the words you have said, and everyone in the room hears, you fucked up again, didn't you?
Yeah.
I said the right words, though. No, you did not mean those words. What's been really interesting to me as I've gone through this list, this is what we we did say this is what this podcast was about. Usually we do it in a pub, and we've finished half a bottle of Villa Maria, so it is pretty good analogy of what we did in the pub. I start to sort of see this, which is each of these items that we talk about, there is an angle, whether it's personal stressors, whether it's team stressors, where you could argue this was a good behavior. You could argue it was the right thing to do. And there's this really fine line between this was positive and moved us forward to this was negative and I'm chipping away at people and I'm adding stress.
Yeah,
Isn't that interesting that
I think it is, and I think that fine line comes back to the point I made at the very beginning, which is we have this idea that stress is negative. There is a like all things, if you imagine a bell curve of your chemical reaction to a situation, the amount of cortisol pumping through your blood and all of the things that are physiological markers of stress. If you are normal everyday situation, you're at the peak of that bell on that bell curve, then everything's normal, you're functioning well, you could just do that in perpetuity. If you are below that, then you're relaxed.
Yeah, you're not at peak.
You're chilled out, you're not at peak performance. If you're really low on that, then you're lethargic and you're really difficult to get any productivity out of. If you're slightly ahead of that, then you're sharp, you're thinking, you're looking out for the next thing, you're looking for the change.
But you by
you can't keep
definition
that up.
well, but by definition, you said there was a peak point in the curve of delivery when you're sharp.
I know, so this isn't a curve of delivery. This is a curve.
Well, no,
this is the curve of the physiological stress status.
Oh,
So
okay.
at
Okay,
peak,
that's fine.
at peak, you're just normal. What you want to be is slightly ahead of that for some of the time where
For
it's
stress, that's fine.
So if you're going out the gate to go into that dark wood where there's enemy out there,
And you're chilled out.
you don't want to be normal. You want to be
Yeah,
on
yeah.
edge,
Agreed.
checking everything, thinking everything, eyes darting around, brain working, a little bit of adrenaline pumping. You can't keep it up, but that's where you want to be for that period of vulnerability. Then when you come back in, you want to bring that rapidly
Yeah,
back down,
very well said.
probably to that relaxed point so you can recharge. There's a point where stress can be really, really useful. What you don't want to do is constantly be going, we are at the peak of our game. We are going to take the fight to the enemy. We're always going to be at that because you'll burn people out. And then there is even further to the right on that curve, which is your heart is beating at 100 beats a minute. You've got cortisol and adrenaline pumping through your body. Your tunnel vision is closed right in. You can't hear what other people are saying because you are focused on the threat.
Funny,
you can do that for about 2 minutes before you start.
When we do the next episode, one of the things I want to talk about is sort of this concept of G-lock, which is exactly what you described, which is when you get to that stressful level, your world, your vision sort of seems to shrink in around you, and all you can see is this very small thing in front of you. All of a sudden now your effectiveness is going through the floor. You're no use to anyone, and people say, why are you useless? No, you've gone that far. Look, let's finish where we are. Thank you. That was actually it's so important to talk through these things, and even though I don't think we answered anything, I don't think we necessarily even revealed something dramatic today. Hopefully we laid it out, particularly with the sort of those different ways that individuals and teams can be stressed, just make you think about them more. I don't have an answer for this, but one thing I do want to say is this is a great conversation with your peers, with your boss, and perhaps more importantly, do it when you're not stressed. Do it when the team is not stressed, because the best prevention is before you start to get stressed.
Yeah.
As you get stressed, every moment you're a bit more stressed, it's twice as hard to come back from that. And that we'll talk about maybe next episode is something that I've seen, which is when people get that stressed, it is incredibly hard to sort of come back from that. I've seen people leave organizations because they were so stressed. And the problem was there was very little you could do. They literally had to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
They had to reset and start again. So anyway, hopefully that was interesting. Thank you, Gareth. Oh, last thing to say, by the way, you probably heard we've got quite sort of sensitive microphones. Us pouring drinks. We do want to make it clear alcohol is not a good primary way to remove stress. It's a Sunday evening, no, Monday evening.
Bank holiday, though.
Bank holiday evening. And so that's why we have the drink. So please don't think we're advocating drinking as well.
Cool. Right. Well, I look forward to coming back and talking about the things we can do to mitigate this. And I think there's a very close relationship with a subject we've done before, which is resilience.
We're going to talk about resilience again.
Absolutely. You build resilience by tackling these issues. So I'm really looking forward to that. If you've enjoyed listening to this, please then watch out for the next episode. Like, subscribe, all of that stuff, wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us, leave us a review, email us on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com, or leave us a message on X, formerly Twitter, @battlingwithbiz. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.